She didn't just delete my work in front of everyone. She deleted the only thing keeping her employed. My name is Tyler Hennings. I'm 48 years old, Senior Client Relationship Manager. If that sounds dry, good. That's what this job is supposed to be: precise, methodical, predictable. In consulting, reputation is the product. I wasn't the face on the billboard, but I was the reason no one sued us for breach of contract. Morgan Barrett never cared about that. She was my supervisor. She liked pretty spreadsheets, clean dashboards. She wanted my department's performance metrics to be a bragging point in executive meetings. She called me a bottleneck more than once. What she didn't realize was that I was the bottleneck, on purpose. Because compliance isn't about speed. It's about making sure the vendor contract our client signed every single clause, including Amendment 14.7, isn't the legal grenade that goes off 6 months later. She didn't care about that detail. Until last Thursday, she scheduled an all-hands review meeting. I walked in to find 23 people waiting. Our open-plan conference room, glass walls, the whole company able to see us. Morgan stood at the front with my audit file on the big screen. 53 pages. Client communications, SLA performance reviews, email escalation threads. Every conversation I logged that confirmed we were satisfying vendor obligations. She called it bloated, said it was the reason our efficiency metrics were subpar. Garbage, she repeated, tapping the keyboard. No one spoke. Then she highlighted the entire document and hovered over the delete key. I remember watching her finger like it was a guillotine blade. She even smiled at me. Any last words? I didn't answer, because she didn't deserve an explanation. She pressed delete. 53 pages of compliance evidence gone. She turned back to the team and said we'd be using standardized communication templates from now on. No more unprofessional social hour. No one moved. I looked around the room. A few people wouldn't meet my eyes. Others stared at their shoes. They weren't angry. They were scared, because they knew something Morgan didn't. That audit wasn't just my notes. It was the only reason our biggest client hadn't invoked Amendment 14.7 of their vendor contract. She didn't just delete my work. She deleted our insurance policy. Let me explain. Amendment 14.7 was an addendum most vendors ignored after signing. It gave the client unilateral right to terminate our entire contract immediately if we failed to maintain a documented relationship management standard. That meant proving, not just claiming, that we met certain SLA thresholds for personal engagement. It existed for one reason. Our client had been burned before. They wrote it in so they could walk away penalty-free the second we treated them like an account number. And we had been getting close to that line. Vendor service quality had slipped. Client complaints were creeping up. My audit was the shield. It didn't fix the vendor's screw-ups, but it proved we were still meeting the personal relationship standard. Morgan didn't understand any of this, because she never read the contract addenda. She read the dashboard. She saw a lack of efficiency. She saw my 53 pages of call notes, escalation emails, vendor remediation plans as time wasted. She didn't see what I saw. A grenade with the pin half pulled, waiting for someone to trip it. After she pressed delete, she gave a speech about professional standards. She said we'd reduce client interactions to 15 minutes max. No personal chit-chat. No inefficient relationship building. I remember a cold feeling in my chest. Not anger. Just the certainty of what came next. She was about to trigger the clause she didn't know existed. I didn't say a word. I let her finish her performance. Then I picked up my notebook from the table. It wasn't the full audit, but it had enough handwritten details. Enough to remember who I needed to call. Enough to confirm which contract amendments she just violated by policy. Because here's the thing about deleting records. It doesn't delete the clause. It deletes your proof of compliance. She just erased her own defense in a contract breach. If you've ever seen someone destroy good work just to look powerful, maybe you'll want to hit subscribe. Because this isn't where the story ends. She didn't realize she hadn't deleted me. She deleted her leverage. The next morning was silent in the office. You could almost hear people breathing too carefully, like the air itself might offend Morgan. She sent an official email at 8:03 a.m. subject line in all caps, new client communication policy. She didn't waste words. Effective immediately, all client interactions must be logged using the new standard template. No personal notes, observations, or client-specific relationship details are to be recorded. This change is mandatory and non-negotiable. No one replied. We all knew what that meant. Our entire approach was being reduced to pre-written lines and checkboxes. No room for nuance. No room for documenting vendor problems clients flagged in private calls. No room for protecting the company from Amendment 14.7. That clause required us to prove meaningful client engagement. Not a standardized greeting, not a form letter, but actual evidence that our team understood each client's priorities, concerns, and even personal context if it impacted service. It wasn't there for show. It was the result of an expensive arbitration 3 years ago. I remembered that arbitration like it was yesterday. I was in the room when the client's lawyer read the clause out loud, voice steady and certain. Your obligation is not to pretend to know the client. It is to know them. Morgan wasn't there. She was new. She didn't have that history. Policy changes don't erase contract clauses. But it wasn't my job to educate her anymore. She'd made that clear when she humiliated me in front of the team. She wanted a war over documentation. I could do that. I spent the next 2 hours opening old email threads. Escalations that hadn't been resolved. Client complaints. Vendor SLA failures. All the things I'd quietly logged because I knew someday we'd need them. I didn't forward them to Morgan. Not yet. I started building an escalation email chain with myself on BCC. Every policy violation. Every potential compliance breach. Every time one of my colleagues slacked me with, "Tyler, I don't know how to handle this under the new template," I saved it. Morgan thought she was enforcing discipline. What she was doing was creating a paper trail, one that showed deliberate negligence. I didn't do this to be petty. I did it because Amendment 14.7 wasn't an idle threat. If the client triggered it, they wouldn't just leave. They'd leave without paying penalties while suing for damages. The company wouldn't survive that. Morgan didn't care, or didn't understand, but the board would. That morning, HR made it worse. They posted a new internal memo on the company intranet. Employees are reminded that any deviation from standard communication protocols will be considered insubordination. I printed it out. I highlighted the phrase. I filed it in my personal folder marked defense. I remember thinking, how many careers are they willing to burn to avoid admitting they were wrong? I started getting Slack DMs from colleagues. Kayla, who managed the West Coast account, sent, "Tyler, what if they ask us about vendor contract 118? They always want personal updates." I told her the truth. We're not allowed to give them any more. She didn't reply after that. Leo Grayson, one of my oldest clients, sent me a personal email that day. He didn't know about the new policy. "Heard you had a tough meeting yesterday. Just checking you're okay. Let me know if we can chat Friday." I didn't answer immediately. Not because I didn't want to, but because I wasn't sure how to do it without breaking the new rules. They called it non-essential. The client called it proof. By the end of the day, I had over 20 internal emails flagged. Questions about the policy. Confusion over what professional distance even meant. Fear of talking to clients like people. Morgan held another meeting at 4:00 p.m. She didn't ask for feedback. She read the policy out loud, word for word, then told us any violation would be documented for HR action. I didn't argue. I didn't roll my eyes. I took notes. I watched everyone else avoid looking at me, because they knew what I was doing. If Morgan wanted every word documented, I was happy to oblige. By the time I walked into the office the next morning, I could feel it in the air. Everyone was talking more quietly. Slack channels slowed down. People had read the policy memo. They knew what Morgan expected now. No personal notes, no empathy, just standardized lines that passed HR's new professional template. She called it efficiency. But efficiency in client management has a price. We'd been paid for our judgment, for knowing when a complaint was routine and when it was a warning sign. Morgan didn't want judgment. She wanted uniformity. The first email I logged that day was from Dennis McAllister's account manager. She wrote, "Tyler, can I still send Dennis the quarterly vendor SLA summary? He always wants notes on the warranty exceptions." I read it twice before replying. "Policy says no deviations. You'll need to use the new template." She sent back one word. Great. I added it to my escalation email chain, because that single message proved the policy was incompatible with Amendment 14.7. The vendor contract required us to share warranty caveats. If we failed to document, we told them they could terminate with 0 penalty. That's what people didn't get. Deleting my audit wasn't just erasing notes. It was erasing legal protection. Morgan had made a bet that no one would notice. But vendor reps notice everything. Midday, we got a Slack ping from vendor support. Client Heather Pruitt wants clarification on response times. She says our last call felt rushed, needs reassurance SLA is intact. Morgan's response in the channel was instantaneous. Stick to the template, don't over-explain. I saw the typing indicators flicker then vanish. No one wanted to contradict her in public. I screenshotted the entire thread. They weren't documenting compliance. They were documenting liability. After lunch, Marge Callahan's team sent an internal email. We've had 3 clients ask why we're suddenly so robotic. Feedback calls are tense. Morgan didn't respond to that one. I did. Log all complaints. Don't change approach. I copied myself on BCC because they were making my case for me. The new policy wasn't just unpopular. It was legally dangerous. I didn't want them to fail. I didn't want clients to walk. But Morgan had locked us into a strategy that made breach of contract almost inevitable. It felt like watching someone steer into a wall while telling everyone to shut up and enjoy the ride. That afternoon, she called another meeting. No questions, no suggestions. Just a reading of the policy again, line by line, as if repetition would make it wise. I looked at my team. Some avoided eye contact. Others looked angry but said nothing. Kayla wouldn't even sit at the table. After Morgan dismissed us, I stayed behind. She noticed. You have something to say, she asked. I met her gaze calm. Just making sure you're clear. Every deviation, every complaint, every client escalation, we're saving it all. She frowned. For compliance. I nodded. For compliance. She didn't thank me. Didn't ask what that meant. She just picked up her tablet and left. Because even she couldn't say I was breaking the rules. The rules said document everything. So I was documenting everything. They wanted obedience. I gave them evidence. If you've ever seen leadership double down on failure, just to save face, you know exactly what I mean. If you know anyone who's watched a management team burn their own house down, share this with them. And if you want to see how far this went, subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. They thought they'd shut me up. Instead, they handed me everything I needed. No one talked much the next day. You could feel it when you stepped into the hallway. Slack messages dried up except for the mandated check-ins. Everyone was afraid to say anything that might be saved. That was the irony. Morgan's policy didn't just standardize our communication with clients. It turned every internal message into evidence. I was documenting it all. The escalation email chain was growing. An analyst from operations pinged me quietly. Tyler, have you seen the vendor SLA? They flagged our last summary as incomplete. I asked for the email. They sent it with no comment. I added it to the chain. It was proof that refusing to share detail wasn't just bad service. It was a breach trigger. Amendment 14.7 wasn't decorative. It was a landmine waiting for a misstep. Morgan didn't understand that. Or worse, she didn't care. A mid-level manager on the West Coast team forwarded me a Slack snippet. Morgan says if they complain, we just apologize and stay on script. Don't admit anything. I saved that too. Because that line would read beautifully in arbitration. They didn't want records. They wanted deniability. By noon, word got around that a big client had formally complained about robotic responses. Vendor support looped in legal. Suddenly there were private Zoom calls all over the calendar. I wasn't invited to any of them, which was fine. I just kept collecting. Each time someone sent me a worried question, I gave them the corporate line. Use the template. Don't deviate. Per policy. They hated it. But they knew what I was doing. And they kept forwarding me everything. Because they were scared too. Morgan issued another policy reminder in the afternoon. No custom notes. No unofficial guidance. Anything not approved was insubordination. She attached a PDF memo clarifying that all responsibility for client communication fell on individual account managers. It was almost funny. She'd written their scapegoat plan in black and white. I saved that memo immediately. If she wanted to put all the liability on them, I'd make sure it was preserved. Compliance isn't optional when the contract says prove it. Kayla sent me a single line Slack that day. We're going to get slaughtered if a client triggers the clause. I didn't answer, because she was right. I wasn't trying to bring down the company. I was trying to stop it from imploding. But you can't help people who won't even see the fire. By the end of the day, my folder had grown to 53 flagged messages. Slack threads forwarded emails policy PDFs. Amendment 14.7 wasn't some abstract threat anymore. It was coming. I could feel it in every stiff smile and forced script people delivered to keep their jobs. And I knew I'd be ready when it did. Because the more they forced us to hide, the more evidence I had. By Wednesday, people stopped pretending things were fine. Slack messages started sounding desperate. Kayla sent me a private ping. Tyler, the client, wants actual SLA details. They said if we refuse again, they'll reconsider vendor relationships. I told her to save the thread. She didn't ask why. We both knew. Morgan had posted another policy update that morning. It wasn't subtle. Any unauthorized deviation from the standard script will result in HR review. Individual team leads will be responsible for adherence and any resulting client escalations. It was the most honest thing she'd written. She wasn't fixing the problem. She was finding scapegoats. They didn't want solutions. They wanted someone to blame. I saved that memo immediately. Slack channels went silent for half an hour. Then they erupted in whispers. What do we do if they ask about SLA carve-outs? I'm not signing off on sending that email. If legal asks who approved this, I'm pointing to Morgan. I screenshotted everything. They thought they were being private, but fear leaks. By noon, HR scheduled mandatory policy clarification calls. They wanted to remind us that refusal to follow the template would be insubordination. One manager asked if the template met contractual obligations. HR said that wasn't their concern. I wrote it down verbatim, because that phrase would look perfect in front of the board. Morgan wasn't leading. She was threatening. She'd built a policy designed to fail and made sure none of the blame landed on her. Compliance only matters when they can't shift the liability. At 2:17 p.m., Kayla forwarded me an email chain. The client literally quoted Amendment 14.7 back to them. We expect you to maintain meaningful documented communication. Please clarify why your team refuses to answer specific SLA questions. Morgan's response was one line. Please refer to our standard communication template. I felt my jaw tighten as I read it. She was daring them to trigger the clause, and she was doing it in writing. I added it to the escalation email chain. By 4 p.m., I had 72 separate messages, Slack captures, forwarded emails, HR memos. Each one was a nail in the coffin. The evidence wasn't just that the policy was bad. It was that they all knew it and enforced it anyway. People stopped sending me their questions. Not because they trusted the process, but because they realized there was no answer that would save them. That's when it really hit me. They weren't just panicking. They were preparing to push the blame anywhere but their own desk, including mine. I wasn't documenting this because I wanted them fired. I was documenting it because I refused to let them hang me for their mistake. Because by the time they realized who the scapegoat was, I'd made sure it wasn't me. The HR meeting invitation hit everyone's inbox at 8:04 a.m. No subject line, just mandatory attendance. People reacted the same way you'd expect when the fire alarm rings at 3 a.m. Slack lit up with quiet panic. Anyone know what this is? Is this about the complaints? Should we prep anything? Morgan didn't answer. She didn't have to. The meeting was scheduled for 9 sharp. No excuses. I watched them file in like they were heading to sentencing. Morgan stood at the front of the room with HR next to her. She didn't waste time. This is to clarify communication expectations. We have had issues with inconsistent messaging and unprofessional tone. No one interrupted, because they all knew what that meant. HR projected the new policy PDF onto the screen. All outbound communication must use the standard template. Any deviation requires Morgan's direct written approval. That line hung in the air, because it wasn't just a rule. It was a death sentence for discretion. They didn't want clarity, they wanted silence. A hand went up at the back. Clients are already complaining about the script. They're quoting Amendment 14.7 at us. Are we prepared to deal with that? HR didn't even blink. That's a vendor contract matter. Our priority is consistency. I wrote that down word for word, because it was going in the escalation email chain. Kayla sent me a Slack while the meeting was still going on. We're screwed. I didn't reply. Morgan clicked to the next slide. Non-compliance will result in formal HR review. Team leads will be held responsible for any client escalations. That was the real policy. It wasn't about improving communication. It was about making sure blame had an address. When you own the script, you own the blame. Someone else asked, voice tight, "Is legal okay with this?" HR shifted uncomfortably. Morgan has approved it. That's all anyone needs to know. That was the tell. Legal hadn't signed off. Morgan had. They were gambling no client would actually trigger Amendment 14.7, or that if it happened they could pin it on someone else. I didn't say anything, because I didn't need to. I just kept typing. I saved the PDF. I saved my notes. I logged Slack messages where people vented privately about being set up. The more they tightened control, the more evidence they left behind. After the meeting, people avoided eye contact. Some muttered apologies for questions they'd asked. Others just went silent. HR sent out the deck 10 minutes later. The last slide was the real prize. All team leads will confirm in writing their understanding of these guidelines. They wanted signatures. They wanted receipts. They wanted admissions of responsibility. I saw Kayla across the room reading the email on her phone. She looked up at me and didn't even try to hide the fear. I didn't smile. I didn't feel anything except cold certainty. If they thought I'd sign away my defense, they hadn't been paying attention. Because when they forced everyone to speak with one voice, I made sure that voice was Morgan's. The day after the HR meeting felt like the office had swallowed its own tongue. Nobody spoke above a whisper. Slack channels went from professional to paranoid. Threads that used to joke about weekend plans turned into sterile compliance check-ins. Can you confirm you're using the template? I'm not comfortable deviating. Forwarding from Morgan's sign-off. It was a graveyard of fear. Kayla pinged me once. They're serious about suspensions. HR told me point blank it'll be on my record if the client complains again. I didn't offer sympathy, because that was the point. Morgan didn't need them to do their jobs well. She needed them afraid enough to obey. Slack lit up again around 11. An analyst sent a direct message. Hey Tyler, you should know, Morgan's compiling a list of who's most non-compliant. She's saying it's for HR audit. I didn't act surprised, because I wasn't. I just typed back, thanks, forward anything you have. 10 minutes later I had a PDF. It was a draft HR memo. It explicitly listed team leads who had repeatedly failed to follow the approved communication template and recommended corrective action. Corrective action. That phrase was deliberate. No mention of context. No mention of the vendor SLA requirement. No mention of Amendment 14.7. Just a bullet list of people to throw under the bus. I added it to the escalation email chain because that document didn't prove incompetence. It proved conspiracy. Morgan wasn't solving the vendor problem. She was constructing a defense. They didn't want help. They wanted absolution. Slack continued its descent into cowardice. I'll wait for Morgan's approval before sending anything. I'm not advising the client on that, sorry. We should make sure everything's logged in case HR asks. In a way, I admired the efficiency. They'd turned a department full of relationship managers into stenographers. No initiative, no risk, just an assembly line of blame shifting. But they were too late. The clients weren't stupid. They saw the change in tone. They were pushing back harder. Emails came in quoting Amendment 14.7, asking directly why their questions were being ignored. Staff sent them to me in quiet panic. Tyler, what do we say? I always gave the same answer. Use the template. They hated it, but they did it anyway. Because fear beats logic every time. Morgan issued another Slack directive at 3 p.m. Effective immediately, all deviations require written justification. No exceptions. That message was forwarded to me too. I added it to the chain. They didn't even realize they were helping me. Every command, every threat, every promise of discipline. It was all documented. Because if they were going to plead ignorance, I'd make sure it was on record. By the end of the day, I had over 90 items in the escalation email chain. Emails, Slack threads, policy memos, screenshots of staff begging for guidance they weren't allowed to give. No one was talking about solving the problem anymore. They were talking about surviving it. Because the more they tried to hide the cracks, the easier they were to map. By Thursday morning, the vendor had stopped pretending to be polite. An official email landed in everyone's inbox. Per Amendment 14.7, we are placing a temporary hold on payment processing until your team provides acceptable communication logs and SLA clarifications. I watched Morgan read it. Her jaw didn't move. She just scrolled once, twice, closed it, and pivoted to HR. No one forwards this outside the senior team. Do you understand? HR nodded, looking like they'd swallowed a tack. Slack threads that morning were short-clipped, desperate. Do we respond? Morgan says no. They'll escalate. I know. I wasn't surprised. They didn't want truth. They wanted silence that couldn't be subpoenaed. At 10 a.m., Morgan sent a blanket directive. All vendor communication is to be paused pending leadership review. No replies without explicit written sign-off. That's corporate speak for, we have no idea what to say. I saved it, because the vendor knew exactly what they were doing. They invoked Amendment 14.7 in writing. They were threatening to break contract withhold payment and blacklist us with partner firms. That clause wasn't just legalese, it was leverage. It existed for exactly this scenario when the client felt they weren't getting straight answers. And now Morgan was ordering everyone to go dark. The Slack channels turned into confessionals. I don't want to get fired over this. Should we warn legal? I'm not paid enough to lie about SLA terms. One of the junior managers DM'd me privately. Tyler, they want us to delete some of the older escalation threads before legal audits. I'm not comfortable with that. I paused, then told them to forward everything to my private compliance folder. No hesitation. Because if they thought a memo could erase the contract, they hadn't read it. That junior manager wasn't doing it to help me. They were scared. Scared of HR. Scared of the vendor. Scared of their own name showing up on an indemnity claim. But fear makes people honest in strange ways. Morgan spent the day locked in calls with HR and the CFO. I could see her through the glass, gesturing, frowning, shaking her head, but never typing a reply to the vendor. She wasn't managing the problem. She was managing the fallout. I added the vendor's escalation notice to the growing chain. I highlighted the specific mention of Amendment 14.7. Because that wasn't a vague threat. That was a pre-litigation signal. Vendors don't say those words unless they're getting their lawyers ready. And Morgan's entire strategy was, pretend it doesn't exist. By 3 p.m., the panic was ambient. People spoke in half sentences. No one made eye contact. HR issued a reminder in Slack. Please remember all vendor communication must be pre-cleared. No unsanctioned updates. It was like telling firefighters not to use water. A senior manager tried to push back. What do I say when they ask about the SLA carve-out? Morgan's answer was brutal in its simplicity. Tell them we're reviewing our policies. That was it. No fix. No strategy. Just stall until the inevitable. I watched it all. Recorded everything. Because once the vendor got serious, there wouldn't be anywhere for Morgan to hide. Friday started with the vendor's formal breach notice. Subject line all caps. Official demand. Contractual SLA violation under Amendment 14.7. Morgan didn't even open it in front of us. She forwarded it to HR with a single sentence. We'll need a holding statement. No acknowledgements. I saved the email chain instantly. Because you don't get an ultimatum like that unless lawyers are already involved. Slack was worse than silent. It was a minefield of seen notifications and no replies. People didn't know what to say, because there wasn't anything left to say. The vendor wanted a full disclosure of our SLA logs, detailed communication history, a signed commitment to corrective action. They weren't hinting. They were laying the groundwork to void the contract and claw back fees. A junior analyst tried to raise it in channel. What's our stance? They're asking for the client communication archive. Morgan shut it down in 4 words. We're not sending it. It was almost elegant in its stupidity. Because Amendment 14.7 didn't just let them request it. It obligated us to provide it. That clause wasn't some polite suggestion. It was the entire foundation of the vendor relationship. We had demanded their compliance. They were demanding ours. HR scrambled. They sent out a damage control memo that might as well have been a suicide note. Staff are reminded to avoid making commitments about vendor communication. All replies must be pre-approved. It was theater, bad theater, because the vendor had escalated past staff. They were talking to legal. I watched it unfold like a play I'd read before. Morgan yelling in HR's glass office. The CFO pacing with his hands clasped behind his back, face pale. Slack ping after Slack ping. We have no plan. They're going to sue. Do we notify the board? I didn't answer any of them, because by then I wasn't part of their team. I was documenting a crime scene. One of the directors tried to rope me in. Tyler, can you clarify our exposure under 14.7? I did. Succinctly. Vendor can terminate immediately. They can also demand reimbursement of any fees paid under breach. Our liability is whatever they can prove we withheld. It wasn't kind, but it was true. He didn't reply. A minute later, I saw his Slack status go offline. Probably on the phone with legal. Morgan issued one last desperate command. Do not send any records. They'll use it against us. I highlighted it. Saved it to the escalation email chain. Because if they wanted me to be their shield, they should have asked before loading the gun. I don't know what they thought I'd do. Delete the records. Lose the audit trail. Pretend I hadn't seen the vendor's letter. They didn't want solutions. They wanted deniability. And they'd spent the last month destroying the only leverage we had, the truth. They told staff not to mention the clause. They told legal it was a misunderstanding. They told themselves it wasn't real. Meanwhile, the vendor's letter sat in my folder, unredacted, time-stamped legal threat in plain English. HR's memo sat next to it. Morgan's Slack command beneath that. The chain was complete, undeniable. By the end of the day, I had 112 separate pieces of evidence. They weren't just panicking. They were burying themselves. Because once legal saw the vendor's letter, there wouldn't be any hiding what we'd done. By Monday, the vendor's escalation letter wasn't just sitting in legal's inbox. It was in front of the CFO. I saw him clutching the printed pages in the glass-walled conference room. His expression wasn't confusion anymore. It was fear. Morgan was pacing beside him, voice low but clipped. We'll say we were collecting clarifications. It's not a violation if it's an internal review. He didn't buy it. I could see that in the way his hand shook when he set the letter on the table. Slack turned sour. Legal is asking for all staff notes on Amendment 14.7. Morgan says we can clean them up before submission. HR wants us to use the standard summary format. Clean them up. That was the polite phrase. What they meant was, make sure the truth didn't make it in. I watched the staff struggle. Some were angry, others terrified, but no one wanted to be the first to refuse. At 2 p.m., HR sent out the official team statement draft. It was 3 paragraphs of corporate exoneration. Our records reflect a good faith effort to address all vendor inquiries. Any delays were due to process clarifications, not intentional withholding. Intentional withholding? They didn't even bother to hide it. They were already lawyering the language. Morgan posted in the main channel. Everyone needs to review and sign the statement by EOD. Legal says we show unity. Unity. That's what they called group perjury. One of the junior leads messaged me privately. What do I do? HR says I'm on the list if I don't sign. I didn't sugarcoat it. You know what they're asking you to do. She didn't reply after that. The CFO tried to rally us late in the day. He called an all-hands meeting. Standing there in the stale fluorescent light reading from notes he could barely hold steady. Look, the vendor wants to blow this up. We need to show good faith. If there were misunderstandings, fine. But this letter accuses us of bad faith. We're not going to let them dictate the narrative. Dictate the narrative. That's the line that stuck with me. Because they weren't trying to fix anything. They just didn't want to look guilty. Morgan chimed in, voice tight. This is standard risk mitigation. Everyone signs. It keeps us aligned. Aligned. What they meant was, if we all lied together, no one could be singled out. I stood there, arms folded, listening, watching them all nod. Some out of fear, some out of loyalty. Most because they just wanted it to go away. I remember thinking how surreal it was, that the same people who refused to admit they'd broken the SLA were now openly coordinating a cover-up. HR handed me the statement last. It was still warm from the printer. My name already typed at the bottom. Morgan didn't even look at me. She just held out the pen. Tyler, please. Let's get this done. I read the paragraphs. Every line was a lie. A soft lie. A safe lie. But a lie all the same. They didn't want accountability. They wanted a scapegoat. I handed the paper back. I'm not signing. Silence. Long enough to feel like punishment. Morgan's eyes flickered. Tyler, this isn't about you. It's about protecting the team. I didn't answer, because what answer was left? The CFO's voice broke the tension. If you don't sign, you'll be out of compliance. HR will have to escalate. I shrugged. Then escalate, because once they asked me to sign, it stopped being their problem. They called me in at 8 a.m. No agenda. Just an HR check-in. Morgan was already there, sitting beside the HR director like she was my lawyer instead of my boss. The table between us was bare except for one thing. The staff statement. The same one I'd refused to sign. My name still typed at the bottom. Morgan didn't bother with small talk. We're giving you one more chance, Tyler. Her voice was calm, almost gentle, like she thought being quiet would make me obedient. I leaned back, watching the HR director shuffle papers, avoiding eye contact. You know what this means if you don't cooperate, Morgan said. Cooperate. That was their word for surrender. I glanced at the HR memo she had on her lap. One phrase was highlighted in fluorescent pink. Team-based accountability for any breach disclosures. They weren't subtle anymore. They'd decided if they were going down, they were taking everyone with them. Morgan slid the printed statement across to me. We need unity. The board is demanding answers. I didn't pick it up. She frowned. Tyler, they're going to review this escalation chain. Legal has the vendor's letter. If you don't sign it, looks like you're the problem. The problem. That's what they'd settled on. Not the clause violation. Not the deletion of logs. Me. Because if you can't fix the truth, you can blame the messenger. HR cleared his throat. Look, this isn't personal. The vendor has threatened litigation. We need to show internal alignment. Internal alignment. Meaning, if we all lied together, there was safety in numbers. I glanced at the escalation email chain in my folder. Dozens of emails, Slack threads, Morgan's direct commands, the vendor's letter cold and formal citing Amendment 14.7. They wanted me to pretend it didn't exist, or worse, pretend it wasn't important. I remember thinking it was funny in the bleakest way. They'd spent a month ignoring the contract, and now they were begging me to ignore it too. Morgan leaned in. I know you, Tyler. You don't want to see people lose their jobs over this. Don't make it about principle. Principle. As if truth was some optional feature. I looked her in the eye, and that's when the delayed emotional reveal finally hit me. I'd been here before. Different company. Different faces. Same betrayal. Years ago, I'd watched my own mentor throw me under the bus to save his career. Signed a false statement that blamed me for an entire project meltdown. I lost my job. My reputation. Spent months clawing my way back one humiliating contract at a time. And even after I rebuilt my career, I promised myself one thing. Never again. Never be the shield for someone else's lies. My voice was calm when I answered. I'm not signing. Morgan's expression hardened immediately. HR will have to note this as insubordination. I shrugged. Note whatever you want. She tried one last time. Don't do this. You'll tank your career over people who won't even thank you. She wasn't wrong. The staff would sign. They'd survive. They'd resent me for refusing. But at least they'd know there was one person in that building who wouldn't lie for Morgan. The HR director scribbled something on his form. I saw the words, final refusal. They didn't even look at me when they dismissed me. I collected my folder and walked out without a word. Because once I walked out of that room, they'd have to lie without me. The final unraveling didn't happen in a blaze of shouting or finger-pointing. It happened in polite board meetings and cautious legal emails. It happened in the hush of hallways where no one made eye contact. The vendor terminated the contract in writing. Formal, brutal. We consider this a material breach under Amendment 14.7. All fees paid to date are subject to reimbursement demands. There wasn't even room to argue. Morgan tried, of course. She scheduled calls, sent clarifications, promised alignment. But the vendor's legal team had receipts. The escalation email chain, her Slack commands, the HR memos threatening staff, everything I'd quietly archived and submitted. When legal finally reviewed my file, there was no denying it. We hadn't just failed to meet a standard. We documented our own cover-up. I heard secondhand that the CFO spent half a day on the phone with the board. That Morgan got pulled into an emergency session with outside counsel. By then, I wasn't even invited to the rooms where they decided my fate. I didn't need to be. I'd already given them the truth. All I could think was how carefully they'd avoided it for months. When the board issued their final internal notice, it was so sanitized it was almost insulting. Due to internal process failures and vendor relationship challenges, leadership changes are effective immediately. No mention of fraud. No mention of staff coercion. Just leadership changes. Morgan's email account went dark within the hour. The CFO tendered his resignation with one line about personal reflection. HR sent a final memo thanking everyone for their patience during this transition. But no one felt patient. People started sending resumes before the week ended. I got 3 private thank you messages from junior analysts who didn't sign the false statement because they saw me refuse. They didn't say much, just I couldn't do it either. I respected them more for that than they'll ever know. The vendor's demand for reimbursement turned into months of negotiation. Peyton ended up paying back nearly half a year's revenue to avoid a lawsuit. Their public reputation cratered. Clients didn't want to be associated with a consultancy that couldn't manage its own compliance. Catalyst Advisors, the headhunter firm that had once ghosted me, was now sending me apologetic outreach offering to help me navigate new opportunities. I didn't need them. I'd already accepted the role at a competitor, one that valued truth enough to pay for it. I remember cleaning out my desk. It was quiet. HR didn't say much. Just handed me my exit paperwork and asked for my badge. I turned it over without a word. No drama. No victory lap. Because it didn't feel like winning. Just surviving. Some people think silence is safety. I know better. Silence is permission. That's why I spoke. Not for them. For me. Because I'd promised myself I'd never be the shield for someone else's lies again. And yeah, it cost me my job. It cost me people I liked. It cost me nights of sleep wondering if I'd made it harder for others who couldn't afford to say no. But it also meant when they tried to rewrite the story, they couldn't erase what I'd recorded. Amendment 14.7. Vendor escalation letter. Escalation email chain. HR's threats. My refusal. It all stayed in the file. It stayed real. They didn't want the truth. They wanted absolution. I wasn't going to give it to them. If you've ever watched someone get punished for telling the truth, or if you've ever been the one forced to choose between safety and honesty, consider subscribing. Because these stories matter, and the people who tell them deserve to be heard. And that's how they burned their own company down, while blaming the one person who wouldn't light the match. I still wonder if it was worth it, but I'd make the same choice again.